There's a new science that's emerging that I'm particularly fascinated with right now, and that's AQ. It's that third Q, and that AQ is the adaptability quotient. Really, stubbornness and being stuck in your own paradigm is not a feature, that's a bug.
Mm.
And it's a leadership bug that, needs to be corrected. An adaptability quotient, also means, you know, getting out of the paradigm that exists and being able to reach for something into the future.
Welcome to Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today, we're talking about an invaluable leadership skill, the ability to see around corners. It's the capacity to anticipate what's coming before it arrives, to sense change before it's obvious, and to lead through uncertainty with clarity and conviction. Joining me is someone who has done exactly that across decades of innovation. Rob Carter. Last year, when he retired from his 31-year career at FedEx, Rob was serving as Executive Vice President, FedEx Information Services, Chief Information Officer, FedEx Corporation, and co-president and co-CEO of FedEx Services. Under his leadership, FedEx was the world leader in logistics and distribution chains, underwent major digital transformations, and embraced emerging technologies like AI and blockchain. Rob, welcome to Science of Leadership. It's a real honor to have you.
Well, Tom, I'm honored to be here with you. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. What a cool topic you've picked.
Thanks. Well, let's jump right in here. Everybody knows FedEx has been, I would say, the leader in global commercial logistics for decades. And a huge part of that success is, I think, the ability to, what I would say, see around corners. And you are at the center of so much of that. I'd love to hear what seeing around corners means to you. When you think about leaders being able to see what's coming before others do, what comes to mind?
Well, first off, I'd never claimed to have a crystal ball or to be some kind of clairvoyant, but I think one of the most important characteristics about seeing around corners is anticipating the fact that you're always making a corner. There's something around the corner that represents change, it represents innovation, it represents something new for your business and something you have to pay attention to. One of our favorite quotes in FedEx was a quote from Marcus Aurelius that said, "The only constant is change," which is a little bit of a paradoxical statement. The change is the constant, but it was something that we really believed, and so we expected change, we anticipated change, and maybe from a leadership standpoint, the most important thing we did was embrace change. You really have to not hunker down into a place where you're not expecting or not wanting change. And to some degree, Tom, it's human nature to feel more confident and like there's less risk in the status quo, and to feel like the move forward is quite risky. Well, I think in today's world that's not true. Actually, I think that we need to recalibrate our risk meters and understand that moving forward with conviction is a less risky strategy than standing still. Standing still is probably the riskiest business strategy that you can have in today's world. And it's like standing on a beach, not realizing that there's a tsunami, getting ready to come up behind you and sweep you off of that beach. So again, recalibrating your risk meters and realize that status quo is very risky and moving forward is what you have to embrace in order to survive.
Well, thanks for sharing that out front and kind of level setting what that means from your perspective. Really appreciate that. Do you have a time that you could share from FedEx when you were able to look at what the company was doing and saw something on the horizon that wasn't yet obvious to others and required a change that ended up having a significant impact on how FedEx operated?
But when I think about that, I think about the internet, but I'm not going to use a whole lot of I in what this happened. This is a team effort, and I'll never forget this meeting that we were having in 1994. We had invited Bill Joy to come into FedEx, and Bill was one of the co-founders of Sun Microsystems, and really a thought leader in so many ways. And one of the things that Bill asked us in this 1994 meeting was he asked us about our website and had we gotten the FedEx domains. At that point in time, we were officially called Federal Express.
With
But, we were kind of looking at each other and feeling a bit awkward at that moment and said, well, we actually don't have one of those yet. But we then quickly pivoted and brought together a skunkworks team of some of our better technical people and business leaders, and frankly, at that time, we were doing some pretty cool things. You could take a diskette and put it in your PC and, your modem would warble and you would connect to the internet and you could track a package, that way. But what we did was pretty groundbreaking. We stood up the original FedEx.com, and the original page was this kind of cool page that was it was an HTML page. It had a little blank, and it had a graphic of a flying package kind of in digital space, and it said enter your tracking number here. So again, we're talking 94 now, and you could key in your tracking number, and we would go to our backend systems with that, and then return a new HTML page that had nicely formatted tracking information about your shipment. Well, we won a Smithsonian Award for that, and there's a display of it in the American History Museum about the first transactional website. Everybody else's website at that point in time was, was a message from the CEO or an about page. There were a few of them out there, but there was none of them that actually did business. And so we think that not only changed FedEx, but it in some ways changed the world. It said, look, this is not just
Yeah.
a communication platform. This is a transactional platform, which of course today is table stakes for virtually everything all of us do.
Yeah. Wow, Rob. Thinking back in your like when you were a young person, let's say in college or whatever, did you ever think that something you'd be intimately involved with would be in the Smithsonian? Like that's incredible, right? Like, wow, you can go to the Smithsonian and you can go, I was a part of that thing, like in a very real way.
I mean, the leadership characteristic is so often embracing. So I was embracing
Yeah.
external input from Bill Joy. I was
Mhm.
embracing our team members and some of the people that had, already kind of built the construct. I can take no credit for the design. We just turned them loose and they came
Yeah.
back. So I was a part of it. I will take credit for that. But the leadership
Yeah.
attribute is to embrace internal, external input. And I always call that the two wings of innovation. If you only embrace external input, it's like you have one wing and you flap around on the ground in circle. But if you embrace internal and external innovation and input, that's when you take flight.
Yeah. I always think of innovation in a similar way. Innovation isn't necessarily just coming up with these totally new ideas. It's taking something in from one space and bringing it into a totally different space in a little bit of a different way, but it's not like you just fundamentally created, something de novo. It's recognizing that opportunity to bring something from outside of your domain in to enhance it or make it better. So we think in a similar way when it comes to innovation like
Well,
that.
the very essence of FedEx is that our chairman and founder Fred Smith, a very interesting innovator. So his family and his father in particular were the founders of Trailways bus lines in the South, and so back in the day, and most people don't remember this, but if you wanted a parcel to get from Memphis to Mobile, you would take it down to the bus station, and you wouldn't have to ride with it. You would give it to them, and they would put it in the underbelly of the bus, and it would move that way. Well, his father passed away when he was fairly young, and his mother remarried, and his stepfather was the founder or the founding commanding officer of the Tennessee Air National Guard. And so that's when he got involved in aviation and kind of the logistical aspects of what the National Guard did. So when you think about that, there's this mashup that occurs between what he was seeing, that there was a need for
Yeah.
for moving parcels, and then, kind of the birth of commercial flight and so many important things that were happening in that world. And so the innovation follows exactly that pattern that you just described. It's putting things together in a unique way to make something new, but it's not de novo.
Well, thanks for sharing that background. I didn't know that about Fred Smith's, history and how that came to be. So that's really an added bonus here to our discussion. When I was talking to Dave Zanka, a former colleague of yours, and he told me, "Hey, you got to talk to Rob because he's just spectacular." One thing, a story that he mentioned to me was how you, and maybe it was multiple people, but he credited you, identified the potential for RF technology long before others had ever even heard of it. Can you share that story?
Yeah, I know exactly what David was talking about, and we had a pretty early effort that said, we had our tracking systems, which were huge part of what we did, and another thing that changed the world that I can't take credit for. I stand on the shoulders of giants there, Fred Smith and Jim Barksdale and others that put the tracking systems together. But I believed that as the internet was expanding and data was showing this, so this is an important thing about seeing around corners is that there were these concussive circles of growth in the internet. It was going from, tens of millions to hundreds of millions to billions. And when it was getting to billions of endpoints on the internet, it was no longer just people communicating through the World Wide Web. There were systems and processes and things that were beginning that communication process. And so it became pretty obvious to me that more and more things were going to be on the network. And so I started a project called Tron at that point in time. And Tron had entered kind of the pop culture world because of the movie, but as a technician, I knew that Tron meant trace on, and it was sort of this active trace thing where if you were a programmer, you could actually watch your code execute, and it was, it was important, but it was a real time thing, not a, touch here, touch there kind of thing. So I believed that we would find ourselves in a world where ultimately, at least high value shipments, but probably almost everything wouldn't just get tracked by scans at waypoints. It would actually be on the network as it was moving. So I started Project Tron and started with RF, but RF had some limitations to it because of the field, the distance that it could go. So we started working with Bluetooth and Bluetooth Low Energy. Well, today we know that as AirTags and tiles and things like that. But we have, a robust system inside of FedEx where we put Bluetooth Low Energy tags inside of high value shipments so that we can see them at all times. They connect to the networks around them. And so it's no longer we touched it here, we touched it here, and we touched it there, and then we delivered it to you. It's thousands of interactions from those sensors that tell you in very near real time where the shipment is. So it was a really fun project, and I got to do some cool things like be on the innovation show with Maria Bartiromo and stuff, talking about the smart package, which was going to be on the network. But part of it is just looking at patterns and data, and what I was seeing was this concussive wave of internet. It was before people were talking about the Internet of Things, which
Mhm.
today everyone talks about. All of our thermostats and our garage doors and everything else with locks to our houses are on net. But there are active sensors out there all over the place now that are also on net, and it became an important part. And I believe the real impact of it is even still, now, well over a decade later, yet to be felt. There's more to come there.
What a great example of and how you, in a sense, did it, right? The looking at the information, looking at where things are and where things could be, and saying, "Okay, what could this look like? How could we utilize this?" And creating or being intimately involved in creating a totally different way to go about something and do this. And that must have been an exciting time, for you, to be able to do those things.
It's one of those things where the reality of it was it wasn't cheap. And so, I mean, some
Sure.
fairly interesting conversations with the CFO and, how much money should we be spending on a research and development project, which was what it was at the time. And we didn't have a huge R&D budget, but I think it's important for everyone to, have teams that, are a little bit unencumbered by the status quo and are able to plow a path into the future. And, as a leader, it was important for me to fight for that. Not,
Mhm.
fight, but, I mean, really make
Right.
my case that it was
Advocate, yeah.
advocate is a great word. Thank you.
Well, again, just, that's exciting. I always get excited to see behind the curtain, of how things unfolded and the real stories that are out there, because we only see what's polished and presented at the end as just people in general. So I appreciate you sharing that. Thinking about this ability to see around corners, it seems to me to be really uncommon. And in fact, it's a somewhat dated study, but there was this study of 140 corporate strategists, and two-thirds said they had been surprised by as many as three high-impact competitive events in the preceding 5 years. So a lot of people who are, again, these were corporate strategists. These are people who are paid to, honestly, I think, see around corners, to see where we should be going, what we should be doing, that sort of thing, and they were getting surprised all the time by really high-impact things. So I don't think this is a common capability, or maybe it's just a capability that people don't practice or don't understand how to, and you've laid out some ways that you've done that over the years. But Rob, why from your perspective is it so important for leaders to be able to do this, to be able to see around corners?
So Tom, to me, it's really important that we recognize that change is expected. That we have to be navigating change, and that in order for us to be concerned about what's around in that corner, we actually have to be making the corner. We have to be moving, and so there's an expectation that we've got to adapt. And so a lot of times we focus on leadership attributes that are related to IQ, how smart people are. EQ, are they relatable? Do they work well with their teams, play well with others? But there's a new science that's emerging that I'm particularly fascinated with right now, and that's AQ. It's that third Q, and that AQ is the adaptability quotient that people have, because really stubbornness and being stuck in your own paradigm is not a feature, that's a bug, and
Mm,
and it's a leadership bug that, needs to be corrected. And so you got to look at your team and make sure that you're finding ways to develop and encourage their adaptability quotient that goes it fits in really well with IQ and EQ,
yeah.
but I call it Q cubed. And it's those three Qs to me that make leaders ready to adapt to change and have an expectation for change as we navigate a world that's changing so fast now. And it's almost scary And now that I've kind of stepped into after being in the salt mine at FedEx, I was the CIO for 25 years, which is kind of crazy. I was the CTO before that. And so I really had a front row seat to an organization. And Fred Smith was my boss virtually all of that time. And so I was working for one of the great leader entrepreneurs, and talk about someone who could see around corners. Fred said in 1978, he said the information about the package is as important as the package itself. Well, what was so prescient about that was there was no information about the package. The tracking systems were incredibly nascent, but he had the ability to see around the corner and say, no, we're going to live in a world where computers and technology are going to give us, long before the internet was a thing, going to give us the ability to see things. And he changed supply chains. And the reason that we had that leadership position was because I think history will look back on him as the inventor of the modern supply chain, where just-in-time inventory became possible because inventory became not just things at rest, but things at rest and in motion. And the information unlocked that in a way that said you could plan your business by when things would get there and have a precision to that. So, an adaptability quotient, also means, you know, getting out of the paradigm that exists and being able to reach for something into the future.
Hey, I'm breaking into the podcast conversation here to share with you an exciting announcement. If you've been following the Science of Leadership podcast for a while, you've heard me talk about the book I've been working on. Well, I'm delighted to share that after over 3 years of work, my book, The 4 Stars of Leadership, is finally available. I'm so proud of this book and what it represents. I'm certain that you're going to find it immensely interesting and helpful as a guide on your journey to becoming a better leader. Seriously, you don't want to miss this book. I'm including a link to the book in the description. I hope you'll order your copy today. And please share it with others who might be interested. Also, please be sure to share your thoughts about the book with me. Now, let's get back to this interesting conversation on the science of leadership. Wow, Rob, there's so much there that you just shared that's just, golly, I don't even know where to start. I mean, often people think about their vision of what they're going to do with an organization or their leadership as linear, and you are exactly right. It's not linear. There are corners all along the way, and we have to expect those corners and expect that there's going to be something on the other side of that corner that's going to surprise us that we need to be ready for. So that's one thing you talked about is just excellent. The adaptability, again, those organizations, countries, philosophies that do not adapt die. I mean, even if we just boil it down to biological systems, those that do not adapt to changes in the environment die, right? And the ones that are most successful, that's Darwinian in a real sense, are the ones who are able to adapt, to evolve, to whatever changes in surroundings. And then the reality of Fred Smith's genius. Let's use the word genius, right?
Yeah.
So many things in business and management domains, Lean, Six Sigma, all that really rest on just in time. And the influence, like that's a secondary influence of that thinking that, wow, it's tremendous. So again, I'm just hitting like 3 big points as you were talking that kind of punched me in the mouth, but just exceptional. Thanks for working through that with me.
Well, to your point, when I was an undergraduate, I was a computer science major, back before it was cool, but I never dreamed, I mean, to be honest with you, I had one of those pinch myself jobs for decades, getting to work with these great teams and great leaders and an innovation genius like Fred Smith, and I seldom use that word and I never use it glibly, but trust me,
Yeah,
Fred is a
right.
legitimate genius in his ability to see the world without the constraints and without the paradigms that so many of us are encumbered by.
Can you think of a good example where that ability to see around corners, other than some that you shared, really had a major impact on FedEx or even any other organization? Because clearly you have had decades of experience in leading, and I can tell just by your vocabulary and some of the things that you say, you've read extensively on leadership and you're dedicated to that. But do you have an example that really highlights this is why it's important?
We're kind of swirling around a bunch of it anyways, but when I talk about standing on the shoulders of giants, Jim Barksdale was the original CIO. I was actually the fourth CIO at the company. But Jim and Fred were this amazing team. So Barksdale became really famous at Netscape, as the CEO of Netscape. But on and on, he was a great entrepreneur and technologist. But one of the things that they did that I just continue to be amazed by was that, and again, this was coming out of the late 70s into the early 80s, they went out and bought up 800 megahertz spectrum coast to coast, so radio spectrum. This is long before there were cell networks. and they put computers in the trucks, in the pickup and delivery vehicles that were out there, and those computers had a radio in them. And that radio wasn't to so we could talk to the couriers that were out there. That radio was so that they could move the edge of computing, because at the same time they were doing that, they were building handheld computers, maybe the first commercial application of handheld computers, little scanners. And so
Mhm.
those scanners, at the point of interaction with our customers, they would scan the package and say it's officially been delivered. We called it custodial control. And it was when we handed custody over to the recipient. Well, it really kind of blows my mind when you think about them buying up radio spectrum, building handheld computers, not so we could talk, but so that we could move data from the edge of interaction. When I think about that, it blows me away still to this day, because now we all carry that handheld computer around with us. We all connect to that network, which, allows us to be out at the very edge of our lives, interacting constantly with systems and capabilities. And, most of that interaction is not talking anymore. It's not a
Yeah.
phone as much as it is as a computer with all kinds of capabilities. So I look at those guys and I shake my head, and it's another one of those pinch me things, is getting the opportunity to, to stand on those shoulders and further the cause in ways that, that I think help the company, grow in significant ways. We certainly saw the company explode across those decades into a global giant. But that's a good example of them doing something that I think changed the world in a lot of ways, because everybody was looking. It was, I'll say this and then stop. When I was doing my MBA in the late '80s and early '90s before I joined FedEx, and we studied a couple of things. We studied, Sabre, the reservation system, which was kind of a multi-carrier strategic implementation. We studied American Hospital Supply because they were doing things that were bringing in, but we also studied FedEx and FedEx's strategic use of information technology. It wasn't record keeping in the background; it was customer interaction and enablement. And so when I got that interesting call from the headhunter that said, FedEx is interested in talking to you, it was the first one of those I ever took. I had a great job, loved what I was doing well in my career, but I jumped at that chance because these guys were changing the world with strategic information technology. And so, watching, and looking for patterns like that is important too.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks for sharing that. Hopefully, our listeners are appreciating this. I'm certainly enjoying it thoroughly. So, well, let's talk about the science of this idea of seeing around corners. The data, the research shows us that seeing around corners isn't magic. It's actually the result of a process, and we kind of hit on that some. Neuroscientists tell us our brains are predictive machines. In fact, our prefrontal cortex is wired to forecast outcomes. And this is largely an unconscious process where we assimilate data from our surroundings with prior experience to develop a sense of what's going to happen. I mean, it's a survival mechanism in a real sense. And in leadership, this ability, what researchers call strategic foresight, is linked to higher organizational performance. In their 2018 study, Rohrbeck and Kuhn showed that strong future preparedness in companies, often referred to as corporate foresight, was a powerful predictor for becoming an outperformer in the industry, for attaining superior profitability, and for gaining superior market capitalization growth. So when leaders build that muscle to sense what's coming, then gain a significant edge. And that's just one example of studies that have been done. I don't want to inundate people. I mean, heck, we got practically the study, right, in FedEx here with us on the show right now. But so anyway, just to say this is valuable, it's backed by data, it's important, and it can be done. And so, in a process manner. So to that end, Rob, you've led FedEx through some huge disruptions, digital transformation, supply chain crises, all that. When you look at that, what are some lessons you've learned about leading through those periods when the future feels uncertain?
You know, Super important to learn how to express your convictions. We all get the gift of being able to see different things. I call it seeing the David, because, Michelangelo, when he went in front of the town council in Florence, when they were looking for someone to carve the David, it was a big, they'd fired one sculptor, and it was kind of a big hunk of marble, a beautiful piece of marble. But Michelangelo said, I can see the David. You just need to hire me to let him out. And so not everybody can see the David, and not everybody's David is seeing the same thing, if I can say that. So when you see something coming, it doesn't mean that everybody else can see it. And so one of the most important and powerful leadership things is to learn how to relate what it is you're seeing so that others can join the ride. And one of the most important ones that I ever did was, as I could see the very model of compute changing. So we were coming out of an era of mainframes, and big mini computers where, everything sort of ran on its own box. And, I was looking at this new thing happening, which, in the technology world was the very beginnings of cloud computing. It was taking, Intel servers and racking them and harnessing all of that compute. It was connecting them to the internet. It was connecting them to, new kinds of storage, and it was a new model for software. And what occurred to me at that point in time was that the dominant design of compute was changing right in front of my eyes. I could see it happening. And so dominant design was an important construct. So I went back and I thought, well, what other examples are there in history of dominant design, which not everybody saw at first, but and I got to tell this story because to me it's fascinating. So
Yeah.
so so when Lincoln became president, Lincoln was a railroad attorney. I mean, he was his original goal wasn't emancipation, and his original goal was to create the transcontinental railroad, and to establish a network of rail. But at that point in time, every rail was private. The Northern and the Illinois and the Central and the Pacific and the Southern, they all had different gauges of railroad. They all had different,
Yeah.
and there were railheads where you simply had to unload the train and reload it onto another carrier. Well, in 1864, Lincoln managed to get the Pacific Railway Labor Act passed, which established a dominant design, 4 foot 8.5 inches for the gauge of a railroad. Well, none of the private companies wanted to do that. I mean, they believed they had it right. There were narrow gauge rails, and but what happened was, this incredible revolution of commonizing the rail system coast to coast,
Mm.
including the transcontinental railroad. I may have said intercontinental before, transcontinental railroad, which was, Stephen Ambrose wrote about it in his book Nothing Like It in the World. And frankly, that changed the world in an incredible way. When let's just say when World War II broke out, the US was the only place that had a dominant design for the rail system. And by the way, if you resisted that dominant design, that's how you became a ghost town. If you had a different gauge of railroad and you said
Mm.
we're not going to do it, tumbleweeds were rolling down Main Street. You weren't keeping up with the change. But that dominant design then allowed the industrial might of the US to effectively, change the outcome of World War II because we could provide a Pacific theater with that industrial might, the Atlantic theater, and fought a war that no one ever thought was possible because we had a dominant design in the rail system. So I use that as an example when I was talking to the executives about saying the mainframes. I started saying things like, "What do you think the probability of a startup company?" Because we were seeing powerful tech startups at the time. What do you
Mm.
think the probability of them building their own data center and filling it full of mainframe computers is? And the probability of that was absolutely zero. But we had a bunch of that. We had the wrong gauge of the railroad. So I was able to convince them through storytelling and examples that they could see the David that I was seeing, that there was a new form of computing that was going to take over and was going to be much more powerful, and that if we didn't adapt to that, we might start seeing tumbleweeds on Main Street.
Rob, thanks for sharing that powerful lesson from, arguably the greatest president in the US. And as you say, coming from, so my mom's father was a lifelong, except when he was serving in World War II, lifelong worker for Southern Railroad. Her brother, my uncle, retired from the railroad as well. So, and I grew up in a tiny little town in East Tennessee that was once upon a time a rail town, and so the railroad touches home for me to think about that, and the reality that that was, as a cardiologist, the lifeblood. It was the arterial system for the United States of America and what we became, what we were able to do in a real way. And so
So
Lincoln's ability to see that, and then you're bringing that in with the same sort of thing that you and folks at FedEx have been able to do repeatedly. And FedEx is, it's clear to me in our discussion today and hearing you describe it, FedEx has this on some level figured out. Like it's systematic in a real sense, which is, I think, allowed FedEx to remain at the fore of their space for decades, which is in this time and space when the average company in the S&P 500 is there for 12 years. So for FedEx to be able to do that for the extended period in this unstable time really says a lot, and I think it speaks to this. So I was wondering, for our listeners out there who want to know how they might be able to develop this ability to see around corners, can you lay out a process that you use, or some key practical tips that you could offer for them? And me, obviously, I'm as interested in it as anybody.
I think the most important thing is to tune in. I mean, don't just expect things that you expect. Tune in and look for things that are surprising or unexpected out there. So it's one of be curious. Curiosity is probably one of the most powerful learning mechanisms. And frankly, Tom, I believe if you're not learning, you're dying.
Yeah.
So I read a lot. I focus on things that are out there on the edge, because one thing about it, and I'll quote my friend Bob Johansson from the Institute for the Future, is the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed.
Mm.
So there are places you can spot it coming, and a lot of times you'll spot something, you say, well, it's not if, it's when that's going to arrive in our competitive ecosphere, in our way of doing business. And so you got to begin the journey to adaptation and assimilation of new things, before it's cool, to some degree. It's really important too. We have a principle at FedEx that's called don't lock on and lock out. We have this tendency to be maybe a little overly convinced that our convictions are correct, and we lock on to one thing and lock out other possibilities. So avoid the habit of locking on and locking out. You just really have to have this expectation, this curiosity, this learning, and this ability to tap in. So I would spend a lot of time personally on the West Coast, just kind of
Mhm.
making the rounds to not just big established tech companies, but startups and things like that. And those were things that I think my team hated it when I did that, because I always come back with some new idea and they'd go, "Oh, here we go," But the reality is I think leaders have to use a lot of sources to stay tuned in to what's going on in the world, and never more so than today with AI and the capabilities of AI,
Yeah.
coming at us. And the generative AI is certainly an incredible new thing. But I remember, as an undergraduate, writing Lisp programs that were all about rule-based AI. AI is not new. So, anticipating that there would be a journey that compute would take that would take it down paths that were, a little more cognitive than just rule-based and,
Mhm.
straightforward binary logic that said, yes, no, and maybe. But the world's changing really fast, and so tune in and don't lock on and lock out. Be anticipating there are going to be things that surprise you. And I wasn't at all surprised by the way that there were strategists out there that were saying they missed 3 out of 5, because I missed 4 out of 5. I'm going to be like, wow, look at that. It's don't be surprised about being surprised is maybe a way to say it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing those. As I've been thinking about it, I came up with a few, and they touch on some of the things that you just shared. Um, I try to enumerate them just so in case our listeners are the type of people who make lists or whatever. But the first one is regularly step back to scan the horizon. Take the time to look beyond your day to day operations. So often, as leaders, it's easy to get caught up in the day to day. Those people that are out there just putting out fires, and I don't think if you're just putting out fires, you're not actually looking to the future to be able to see how do you prevent those fires from happening in the future and changing things. So I think that's one thing, scan the horizon. The second, and you just hit on this when you visited Silicon Valley and other places, but talk to people outside your industry because they see things that you don't, and they see them in different ways, and so you might be able to incorporate those. The third thing, study early signals. Trends begin as whispers, so learn to listen. The fourth thing, and this is hard sometimes, encourage dissenting views. Divergent thinking often sees what consensus misses. And then the final thing is practice future back thinking. Imagine your desired future, then map the path backward. So those are the five things that I would say came to mind as I was thinking about this. Any thoughts on
Great
those?
list. Great list. And, I mean, our thoughts overlapped quite a bit. And I actually think Bob Johansson wrote a book about future back here recently that's probably worth our listeners taking a look at.
Yeah.
And this idea, because too often, we're sort of oriented towards moving forward, and half the dialogue that I put forward was moving forward. But a lot of times, imagining a future and working your way back from it is a great way to get a breakthrough and new insights.
Yeah, I'll definitely have to read that book, and we'll include it in the show notes, the reference to it. I was reminded of a 2005 paper in Harvard Business Review. George Day and Paul Shoemaker published this assessment instrument that they had devised that combines your need for what they call peripheral vision with your capability for having peripheral vision. And through that instrument, you can assess if you're what they defined as vulnerable, neurotic, focused, or vigilant. Wherever people fall,
Can you be all of those? I've sort of
probably
seen
at different times, I imagine so. But I'll reference that paper in the show notes. But it seems to me, Rob, that in listening to you and the things that you've done, you probably fall into that vigilant category.
Well, thank you. I'm honored that you'd say that and flattered you'd say that. But yeah, it is a level of vigilance. I mean, that's that tune in thing that I was talking about. You
Yeah.
got to work at that. You have to be a lifelong learner. You can't stop learning, and that vigilance is really about learning and being dedicated to learning and being curious all the time. Because even now that I'm retired from my day job, there I'm almost too busy, to frankly, because of the vigilance of that. I've got several things going on that are, just, I didn't retire so I could have a custom fitted rocking chair, but I'm also questioning myself. Well, you can't do too much. You got to have some time too, which
Yeah.
is also part of what your list was. Is boy, don't believe that burning your nose on the grindstone is the way to insight. I mean, stepping back, relaxing, having fun, going, following your own interests, not just your business interests, is the essence of creativity. I mean, most of our breakthrough thinking comes when we've relaxed our mind,
Yeah.
on these issues, not when we're just pressing in. So I love the list, and I believe that the essence of that vigilance is curiosity and
Mhm.
entering every situation, not judgmentally or in despair. I mean, no matter what it is, the world around us, enter with curiosity. I mean, have some expectations, that you need to understand, a lot of different points of view, not just the ones that come naturally to you.
So our listeners have heard me say this before, but I'm reminded of something General Jim Mattis shared with me when I had the opportunity to. I've had multiple opportunities, but to speak with him and interview him and so forth. And he said, "Listen with a willingness to be persuaded." And that in that admonition, there is curiosity, right? Like you have to be willing to say, what does this person have to say? What's valuable in it? Be curious as to what they're thinking. So I really appreciate you sharing that curiosity underpins this idea to a very large extent. Before we end out our conversation, Rob, I have one final question for you. What's the most valuable leadership practice you use throughout your storied career?
I'm gonna couch that inside of a mantra that I have, and it's something I wrote down as a little plaque that someone made for me, after they heard me say it a few times. But my mantra is work hard, lead a balanced life, and have an undying respect for people. And I want to unpack that a little bit. Yeah, it does take vigilance. It takes hard work. You have to be disciplined in this world, and rigor matters. It just does. But you always have to put that inside of leading a balanced life. I was a little bit of a life balance freak in my career. Most people would tell you, that I wasn't the first guy there or the last guy to leave kind of guy. I mean, I have a lot of interests. I mean, I love the outdoors. I love people. I love wine and food. I love to try. I mean, there are all kinds of things that excite me about and I certainly love my family. I have 5 kids and 8 grandkids, and, I mean, life is and so those are things that would invigorate me. So working hard was important, but leading a balanced life was equally as important, because again, I don't think creativity comes from burning your nose on the grindstone. And then that last piece maybe is the most valuable leadership. Have an undying respect for people. And it doesn't matter, be approachable, be accessible. I spent, 30 years in the executive offices of our company, and never once did I ever turn down someone's request for a one-on-one, unless there was some legal reason not to, or
Sure, sure.
something like, I mean, but having respect for people and every aspect of your life, all the people around us that make our lives better, and do the work that makes the world a better place. So I those three things really matter to me, and established my kind of leadership ethos was that and respect for people. I didn't try and put myself on an ivory tower, and I wasn't a workaholic, but I was willing to roll up my sleeves and work hard. So
Mhm.
so I don't know if that even makes sense, but those three things come together as what created the leadership ethos for me
Yeah.
was that definition.
I think it's a great mantra. I think it's a great thing to lead by. You're in so many ways be the example, right? Like that's a fundamental principle of leadership, of great leadership. Be the example. Work hard, but that doesn't mean kill yourself doing it. Because as you say, you need to have a balanced life so that you can have the energy to work hard. We can burn ourselves out and then we're no use to anybody. And then respect. I mean, the 4 stars that I've talked with, dignity and respect, show dignity and respect. I can't tell you how many times I've heard them say that, right? And what a great place we would have if we all respected each other a little bit more these days, right?
For sure.
So, well, Rob, it has been extraordinary. It's been informative. It's been fun. I've learned an enormous amount from you today. I really appreciate you taking the time to be on the Science of Leadership today.
Loved every minute of it, Tom, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.